Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 7 of my series, The Mexican-American War, New Mexico and California. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Santa Anna could have simply waited for the American army to march deeper into Mexico until it was overextended. But he wanted glory. So he led his army on a grueling march to attack Taylor at Buena Vista, where he was defeated after a bloody battle. While the victory was welcome news in the United States, it confirmed the likelihood that a large part of Mexico would become American, which sparked a bitter debate in Congress over whether or not the new states should become slave states. The situation in Mexico was grim, but it became worse when militia units made up of members of the upper class revolted. The coup attempt failed, but it distracted the government just as Winfield Scott prepared to attack Veracruz. It is vital to remember that President Polk had provoked a war with Mexico to have an excuse to annex New Mexico and California. Well, the war had started, so Polk sent a force of regulars under Brigadier-general Kearny to claim New Mexico. In theory, the 2,000 men led by Kearny to seize New Mexico would be overwhelming, but it would be a major challenge to move so many men across rough territory, and they might find that Mexico would reinforce the region. Kearny was the natural choice to command the New Mexico expedition since he had 3 decades of experience on the Great Plains, exploring, building forts, and signing treaties. Patient and hardworking, he was a strict disciplinarian but fair, which was appreciated by the tribes he dealt with. Kearny led 1,000 regulars and 800 Missouri volunteers out of Fort Leavenworth, and another 500 Mormon volunteers would follow Kearny after they completed their training. The expedition followed the Santa Fe Trail, which passed through rough terrain, so the lack of water, fuel, and fresh food resulted in numerous deaths before they reached Bent's Fort, a large trading post located in what is now southeastern Colorado. Having completed roughly 2/3 of the journey, the men rested while Kearny sent emissaries to Santa Fe with a letter notifying the governor that he would arrive with an army. The key emissary was James McGulphin, who had lived in Mexico for 20 years and was a good acquaintance of the governor. While the private conversation remains unknown, Governor Armijo publicly replied that he would lead 6,000 men to resist the invasion. Actually, the immediate threat was the terrain. The march from Bent's Fort to Santa Fe was grueling. 2/3 of the horses had died, and the men barely had enough food to keep them alive, while there was almost no water. At least there had been no problem with the locals. Although he had an army, Kearny genuinely hoped to conquer New Mexico without killing anyone. As a result, he had kept the army moving quickly to ensure that the volunteers had no time to get into trouble, since robbery and rape would make occupation of the region much harder. Could Armijo have resisted Kearny? While he only had 250 regular troops, he had gathered a couple of 1,000 men at an easily defensible mountain pass roughly 15 miles from the city. If Armijo had blocked the American advance, it would have been difficult for Kearny to keep his men in the region, since the small settlements along the route could not feed 2,000 men. However, he had clearly decided to abandon New Mexico since he abruptly rode back to Santa Fe when he learned that Kearny was approaching. A trusted follower had already gathered his wealth, and he left the province. Resistance crumbled, so Kearny reached Santa Fe unopposed on August 18, 1846. New Mexico had been captured relatively easily, but New Mexico only mattered to Polk because it connected the United States to California. So, what was happening in California? The original American immigrants to California were merchants or sailors who merged with the local society. However, when the fur trade declined, trappers needed a new way to earn a living, so they sold their hard-earned knowledge of routes over the mountains to settlers searching for more fertile land. At first, these settlers were welcomed by Mexican officials who believed that they might stimulate the local economy, but these new immigrants were confident in their superiority and anti-Catholic, so they refused to integrate. Most important, their recent Texan Revolution was a case study in how they simply needed to attract enough immigrants, then they could seize control and give themselves the best land. The situation was stable, but tensions could easily ignite if someone stirred up trouble. That someone would prove to be John Fremont, who arrived with 60 men. Fremont was already a national celebrity following his exploration of the region west of the Mississippi, where he had proven that the land was fertile. Despite his nickname, the Pathfinder, he had discovered few paths, but had produced extensive maps and described the region in detail. To be honest, his guide Kit Carson should have been called the Pathfinder and Fremont the Recorder. Still, Carson became deeply loyal to Fremont, who had given him a new career, paid him extremely well, and let him do what he loved. Fremont was permitted to spend the winter in California, but was supposed to leave once the snow melted and the mountain passes opened. War had not been declared when he left the United States, but fighting was expected to start soon. Regardless, Fremont acted as if he had secret orders from someone in the administration. Admittedly, he had met with Polk before he left, and Senator Benton was his father-in-law, but he never produced anything in writing or even claimed anything specific. When Fremont raised an American flag at his encampment, Mexican troops began to gather nearby. He soon left, but did not go far, as if he was waiting for someone. That someone turned out to be Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie, who had made the trip to California through Mexico under disguise. He carried dispatches and an official message, but had burned it after memorizing the contents. In April, Gillespie found Fremont and told him that Polk worried that the British planned to seize California, so he should seize it first. Actually, Mexico and the United States were already at war, but no one in California knew that. Conflict was already brewing between the Mexican troops commanded by General Castro and the American settlers, who asked Fremont to lead them against the Mexicans. The settlers were well armed, unlike the Mexican residents, and there were only 7,300 Mexicans in California at the time anyway. Officially, Fremont replied that he had no authority since war had not been declared, but unofficially, he helped the Anglo settlers organize themselves. The revolt began on June 12th when the Americans captured Sonoma without any violence. As the victors debated what to do with their prisoners and worried about armed reprisals, the more determined among them raised a flag with the image of a California grizzly bear as the symbol of their republic, which became known as the Bear Flag. Fremont could truthfully state that he had not told the Bear Flag hotheads to seize the village of Sonoma. However, he had met local Americans for over a month and encouraged them to revolt, while repeatedly emphasizing that he could not intervene unless the Mexican authorities in California committed an act of war. Basically, the settlers had to first risk their lives in order to provoke the local government to arrest or even shoot the rebels, then he would lead his men to support them. The Bears' takeover of the village had been bloodless, but General Castro understandably reacted by issuing an ultimatum that all American foreigners should leave California or they would be driven out. Finally, Fremont had his provocation, since he would be defending American citizens, so he led his men and 100 local volunteers to join the Bears at Sonoma. He also stopped calling himself an explorer. Instead, he described himself as Commander of United States Forces in California, which, to be fair, does sound nicer than explorer. He even persuaded the Bears to backdate the start of the revolt to the day he arrived to ensure that he would be described as a leader of the revolt. Meanwhile, Kearny had spent 5 weeks in Santa Fe strengthening the fort and implementing a legal code designed by 2 of his subordinates. Everything seemed stable, so he left on September 5, 1846, with over 300 troops. The 500 men of the Mormon Battalion were expected to be coming close behind, but by a different route. Colonel Doniphan's regiment of Missouri Mounted Volunteers was left behind. since they were supposed to be relieved by the newly raised 2nd Regiment, which was supposed to arrive soon, at which point Doniphan would march into Chihuahua. As Kearny rode towards California, he discovered that the various tribes had risen up since the Mexican occupiers were now weak. Outraged, Kearny sent Doniphan new orders, directing him to march against the Navajo, who had refused to attend a council to arrange peace between the tribes and the new American citizens. The Navajo explained that they had no grievances against the Americans since they did not know them, but they had been fighting the Mexicans for decades and would continue. It was their land, and the Americans should mind their own business. When Doniphan explained that the Mexicans were now Americans and thus protected by the American army, the Navajo accepted this argument and signed a treaty. While Santa Fe had been stable when Kearny left, it did not stay stable for long. The instability was caused by numerous factors. The volunteers did not treat the locals well, and their poor hygiene was blamed for an epidemic of measles that had killed hundreds of Mexicans and Indians, mostly children. While the Americans did not intend to replace the Catholic Church, they would not give the priests the honored position in society that they were accustomed to. Colonel Price, the commander of the volunteers, was not worried, but Governor Bent had lived there for decades and knew that it would be difficult to govern New Mexico, which had been isolated from the rest of Mexico and followed a Catholicism more closely related to the Inquisition than modern day. The occupation force did not have enough translators, money, or troops to do a proper job of occupation. Worse, once the main army had marched away, the various tribes unsurprisingly decided to test the new soldiers, so there were raids by the Apache, the Kiowa, the Utes, the Navajo, and the Comanche. Only the Pueblos seemed calm. Until they rose up. 17 Americans, including Governor Bent, the sheriff, and the United States attorney, were murdered by mobs of Pueblos and New Mexicans in Taos. After an orgy of killing, roughly 1,000 men marched on Santa Fe, but they were badly armed and badly led, while Price's men were relatively well trained and had artillery. After 2 short battles, the rebels retreated to the Taos Pueblo. They sought refuge in the huge church of Saint Jerome, thinking that the Americans would not attack a church. They were wrong. Price's howitzers fired at the church, but the huge walls of soft mud brick simply absorbed the explosions. Switching tactics, Price ordered a frontal attack that managed to cut a small opening in a wall, which enabled a small cannon to fire directly into the church, slaughtering many Pueblos. The enraged troops then entered and killed more. Many Pueblos who tried to flee were blocked by the force of local volunteers who had been placed to prevent anyone from escaping. Seeking revenge for dead friends, they did not take prisoners. 30 Americans died in the battle, but nearly 200 Pueblos had been killed. Several weeks later, a short trial condemned 6 ringleaders to hanging. However, the uprising that had taken place across the province had not been organized solely by Pueblos. Only local leaders and priests had the necessary contacts, but they had not acted publicly, and the Pueblos refused to reveal any names, so they were the only ones who paid a price. Meanwhile, Doniphan had marched into Chihuahua, and he defeated a larger Mexican force on Christmas Day. Encouraged by the victory, he continued deeper into the province. The American force fought a much larger Mexican army on February 26th at the Sacramento River, where the Mexicans had fortified the pass. However, the Americans won an artillery duel, and worn down by the artillery bombardment, the Mexicans would not stand for long, so they were soon routed. While the victory was impressive, its main result was drawing troops away from the Battle of Buena Vista, fought in nearby Coahuila, 5 days earlier. The battle had barely been won by Taylor, so several thousand more Mexican troops might have enabled a Mexican victory. This is a good opportunity to remind everyone of the scale of the American invasion. Mexico was being invaded in several regions and lacked the population and the transportation networks to defend its huge border with the United States. General Taylor marched into Nuevo Leon and Coahuila. General Kearny had conquered New Mexico. Colonel Doniphan had marched into Chihuahua, and California had just fallen to American rebels aided by Fremont. Finally, Winfield Scott was organizing a giant amphibious operation against Veracruz, Mexico's greatest port. Over in California, Fremont led his men to Monterey, where he saw the American Pacific Squadron. Fremont was disappointed to learn that Commodore Sloat had been ordered to blockade California ports, not occupy all of California. However, Sloat was soon replaced by Commodore Stockton, who shared Fremont's desire to occupy California. To speed up the conquest, he commissioned Fremont a major in command of a naval battalion of mounted riflemen. The combined force of volunteers and Marines had gained control of California by August, or at least Stockton thought that California had been captured. But fighting continued throughout the fall until Kearny arrived with more men and the last Mexican force surrendered on January 13, 1847. Stockton appointed Fremont military governor of California 3 days later. Although Kearny had clear authority to occupy New Mexico and California, it was unclear who was actually in charge, but Kearny and Stockton cooperated relatively well. Fremont saw the situation differently and claimed that his authority came from Stockton, so he was independent of Kearny. Since they came from the same social circle, and Kearny had expressed a desire to return to New Mexico, it would have been natural for him to appoint Fremont governor of California and leave. If Fremont had simply acknowledged Kearny as his superior, which he refused to do, and which was clearly insubordination since he was still an officer in the American Army. Worse, Kearny received orders from Winfield Scott appointing him civil governor, just as Stockton had learned that he would be replaced, and civil government would be the responsibility of the senior army officer, namely Kearny. Now that the command issue had been settled, Kearny set up a civil government in California, handed over authority to a subordinate, and then began the long journey back to Washington. Instead of serving as interim governor, Fremont was put under arrest and brought back to face charges. The Benton clan immediately lobbied for a favorable verdict, but the military court found Fremont guilty of insubordination and recommended dismissal. Polk upheld the charge of insubordination but did not dismiss Fremont from the military. Instead of expressing gratitude, Fremont resigned when Polk refused to overturn the charge of insubordination. Benton then broke off relations with the president, who thus lost a valuable ally in the Senate. To sum up, Polk wanted New Mexico and California, so Brigadier-general Kearny led a small army to Santa Fe. It is unknown if the outnumbered Mexican garrison could have held out, since resistance crumbled after the governor fled. Meanwhile, famous explorer John Fremont had instigated a revolt by American settlers in California, even though Fremont did not know that the United States had already declared war on Mexico. The region had been captured when Kearny arrived, but Fremont declared that he had independent authority, even though Kearny was his superior. However, Kearny received orders appointing him civil governor, so Fremont was sent back to Washington in chains to face a court-martial for insubordination. Well, Polk had achieved his goal of adding New Mexico and California to the United States, but the war was far from over. General Winfield Scott had invaded Veracruz, and I will discuss the battle for Veracruz and the battle for Mexico City next episode. Thanks for listening.